Thank you for joining us today to learn more about scenario planning. We're getting a lot of inquiries about this process as a great tool to help organizations navigate planning in the time of uncertainty. So before we dive in, I'm Molly Penn, and I created Penn Creative Strategy to help leaders navigate strategic decisions. At PCS, we're particularly interested in how good strategy can help rebalance and disrupt existing systems of power and access. I'm joined today by Janice Shapiro, one of our senior consultants who's held various positions on both sides of the funding aisle, ranging from executive director to program officer. Janice is also a leadership coach. So Janice, hello.
Am I there? Hello.
You are.
Okay.
And we're also joined by our diversity practice leader, Sophia Cheyenne, who will be monitoring our chat stream as we go and helping us out today and can tell us when there's something that needs further clarification. So we'll save some time at the end for your questions and answers, but of course, if anything is unclear as we're moving through the webinar, don't be afraid to use the Q&A box to raise a question because Sophia will be watching for that. So we'd like to start off with a brief poll, just so we have a sense of your role in the sector and who's with us in the room today by role. So we've just launched the poll. Please take a couple of seconds to give us your answers, and we will close the poll out in 3 seconds, 2, 1. Okay, let's close the poll. Okay, good. So looks like a mix of senior leaders of nonprofits and some consultants on the line. So welcome everyone. Good to have you all with us. So why are we talking about scenario planning? As we mentioned, this is an ideal time for scenario planning because the environment around all of us is so uncertain with regard to forces that will affect the way you do business and what you do. We've never seen such a universal need for scenario planning as now, since COVID is affecting every single organization and there's tremendous civil unrest in our society, making a lot of things highly uncertain. So scenario planning is an agile strategy development process designed to help you adapt quickly to changing circumstances, which is what makes it ideal for this environment. Even under more normal circumstances, we're all living through a period of exponential change. So scenario planning is a great tool to consider possible futures and plan accordingly. I want to share a little quote here from Louis Pasteur. Scenario planning is all about feeling prepared for whatever the world may be about to throw at you. It positions you to respond more quickly and with a plan that you've had time to think through. So we really like this kind of tool in this environment in particular. Scenario planning generally follows a cycle like many planning processes. So it starts with determining a focal question. So the question at hand that you're looking to answer or resolve through the scenario planning process. From there, we identify the driving forces of change in our society and select the things that we think are the most critical to our organization and the most uncertain. Using those critical uncertainties, we then articulate scenarios, which are sketches of the world in the future, in different future states, that we use as a jumping off point for designing strategy to meet those scenarios. So how will you position your organization if the world goes this way or that way? And finally, we monitor indicators like many planning processes, but not indicators of did we do what we said we were going to do, or did we execute the plan properly, but rather how is the world actually evolving compared to what our assumptions were? And at what point along that evolution does it seem clear to us that it's time to iterate the strategy process again so that we're continually adapting the strategy to meet the environment? So I'm going to turn it over to Janice to start us off by talking about the focal question.
Thank you, Molly. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. So the first part of this process is determining what the focus of your inquiry is. And this could be something very specific and narrow, such as, should we merge with another organization? Or it could be much broader, such as, what are the key factors that will influence our ability to carry out our mission? And we actually, later in this series, we are offering a webinar about merger, partnership, collaboration considerations. And this is an example, this is an interesting example to at this moment in time, because so many, particularly small organizations, may find that they don't know if they can survive this. So it might be something that they might actually want to consider. It's a big shift, of course, but it may be what needs to be created to help them survive. So you can use scenario planning in a very broad way, just trying to understand what the future is going to bring. But we have found that it's best if you do try to focus on a very specific question that's going to potentially affect you as you move forward. So for today, we're going to use an example of an organization with a very specific focus, and their focus is to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in all facets of their organization. So once you've determined, you'll see on that on the slide, once you've determined what your focal question is, the next task is to, as Molly said earlier, identify what we call driving forces at play in the external environment that can affect your organization. So these are, of course, things we cannot control, but which probably will exert some kind of influence over how you and all organizations will have to operate. So here is where we actually suggest, actually, let me back up one second, because I want to say one thing that I realized I forgot to say, which is when you're determining your focal question, that is probably a process that's internal in your organization. It's probably staff, management, board members, whatever, however it's defined in your organization. At this point, when you start to move into what are external forces that may affect you going forward, this is where we suggest that you also can ask for help from your people outside your organization, people that you respect, donors, educators, community leaders, anybody that's perhaps outside, but somebody that you have some kind of connection with, and to ask them from their perspective, what do they see as the driving forces that we'll be facing as we go forward. So just a little participation moment here. I'd like for you to just put into the chat what you think, if you were to ask people in your, outside of your organization, your outside thinkers, ask them this question, what do you think they would say now? What would their perspective be? I mean, we can pretty much guess a couple of them, but I'm just curious to see what some of you might put in it. So just knock it off in the chat there for a few seconds.
So we have start some answers rolling up in the chat here. Elections and policy directions, instability, rising inequality, COVID, funding.
Great. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
We have police brutality, systemic injustice, healthcare and educational inequity, food injustice. Another driving force, response to global climate change.
So you can see that there's, certainly a wide range of possibilities. And this moment, as we know, how can any of us even describe this moment? It's unprecedented. It's just, I'm sure many of you feel a lot of overwhelm, shock, pain, grief at this time. So there's a lot. to think about at this time, which is another reason why scenario planning can fit so well with this time, because it's not traditional strategic planning, which many of you I know have probably gone through, was very much setting goals, setting objectives, then you list the tasks and everybody has a timeline. That probably wouldn't work right now. So scenario planning, which kind of sets up different scenarios and how you're going to respond to them, we found to be very effective in times of distress and crisis such as this. So the next slide shows you that while we're talking about the external forces, we want to be sure that you're actually thinking outside in as well. So once you've identified some external forces, that you do want to consider internal driving forces, or the effects of what could happen on the inside. So you can see the differences in this slide here, where externally, you know, it's everything you all mentioned in the chat. It's economic, it's political, it's social, and those are things that we cannot control, versus those in the inner circles, which are forces that may arise within the operation of your organization, you know, such as your customers, your constituents, your people in your community, your partners, your competitors even, and possibly even funders. And that's where you can certainly have an influence on those people on the inside. So you might find yourself actually feeling overwhelmed at this point in the process if you were to start, when you start doing this, because you have a focal question, and then you now have a list of forces. But we're going to share with you how you can pare down this list so it feels doable to you as a planning tool going forward. Once you have your list of driving forces, you want to, or we would like for you to, rank them in terms of the most critical uncertainties. This is how we're then going to arrive at the two most critical uncertainties. And you'll want to rank them using two criteria. One is, which of these issues which is the most critical to your organization? And why most critical? Because that means they stand to exert a high level of influence on how you operate. The second criteria is, which are the most uncertain. Why most uncertain? Because the less predictable these forces are, the more you will need to be prepared for what might happen. And we certainly are experiencing that now. None of us knew what was going to happen when there was a global health crisis. And just think to where you were back at the beginning of March or end of February, and where you are now. I imagine most of you couldn't have made this up, even if you tried. So, so I just again want to pause and just say, so in this process of scenario planning, you determine the focal question, identify the driving forces, and rank them. And then now you're at the stage where you're going to pick the two most critical uncertainties. As with any process, it's important to consider who needs to weigh in now at this point on these questions and decisions as we move forward. Earlier, when you were determining your driving forces, we suggested that you look outside your organization. So at this point, there's no right answer here as to who you want to help you determine your critical uncertainties. It really depends on your organization. It may be, of course, a mixture of your board and staff. It might be, if you're an arts organization, it might be a mixture of your board, staff, and the artists that you serve. There may be, again, people that you asked for their guidance around external forces, and maybe you want to keep them in now to help you identify the critical uncertainties. My experience in the past with doing more traditional strategic planning processes was that some of the ones that turned out the best were actually the ones where it wasn't just the board and the staff. It certainly wasn't just the board. It was the board and staff, and very often people in the community or constituents or people benefiting from the services that you offered. So it's important that you're going to have different scenarios of different groups. Whatever works for your organization, you need to figure out the best way to pick the 2 most critical uncertainties. And just a couple of things to remember here at this point in the process is you also want to think about, as you're putting your groups together, how do you want to be sure that this process is inclusive and transparent? And also, you want to be efficient and make progress. So that's just something else to keep in the back of your mind as well. So I'm going to turn it back to Molly now, who will take a deeper dive into helping you define the critical uncertainties and then how to build scenarios from those uncertainties.
Thanks, Janice.
Sure.
Yeah, so you've narrowed down your 2 critical uncertainties. So the next step is to plot a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, where one axis is one of your critical uncertainties and the other axis is your other one. And typically what we do is we imagine opposite ends of the spectrum of these uncertainties. So in this case, we're talking about economic health and infection rate. So infection rate might be high or infection rate might be very low and controlled. The economic health might be weak or it might be very strong. So we're kind of looking at these extremes in order to help us cast the different scenarios and ensure that they're distinct enough from each other that they merit different strategic approaches. So now that you've done that, it's time to start sketching your scenarios. And scenarios, what's important to know about scenarios is that they're not meant to be predictions of how the future will unfold. They're meant to be provocative, plausible stories of how it might unfold given these various extremes in your critical uncertainties. So, it might go this way if the economy is really strong and the infection rates are very low, or if the economy is really strong and the infection rates are really high, it might go a different way. And so you're making sure that each one of the 4 scenarios that you're writing is going to feel legitimately plausible and like, okay, if given this extreme state of one of these critical uncertainties and the other one, this makes sense as a plausible future. So they're really hypotheses. If this happens, then this is what the world might look like. So you're going to write 4 different scenarios of the future, and we'll show you what that looks like. And I apologize for the small typeface here. We will be sharing these slides with you as well as these handouts for you to work with. So we'll be sending these to you after the webinar. So as you can see here, on the left side of this matrix, we're assuming a weak economy. And on the right side, we're assuming a strong economy. In terms of infection rates, at the top, we are assuming high infection rates, and at the bottom, we're assuming low infection rates. So let's take a look at 2 of these quadrants just for the sake of seeing what the opposite scenarios might look like. So in our upper left quadrant of high infection rates and a weak economy, we are seeing that some organizations may not survive. Most of those that do will probably pare back their operations to focus on the most critical needs or their unique competencies. And we also know, because remember that the example we're using in this webinar instance is an organization that wants to work diversity, equity, and inclusion into all aspects of their mission. So we also know that the infection rates and the weak economy together both disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color. So what we're imagining is that organizations will seek to provide more services virtually in this environment, right? So if the infection rates remain high, we're all going to have to find ways to do more of our work virtually. We'll be doing more pared back, more concentrated work that's the most needed. And that's for the organizations that are able to survive the economic downturn. So let's imagine a different world, the world in the bottom right quadrant, where we have low infection rates, and a strong economy. So that could be the world before COVID happened, but in this instance, we are assuming it's the world after COVID, and we've been successful in managing to control the infection rates. So in this world, there are funds to go around. So that's a much nicer picture to think about. But funders are aware that we've come through something huge. And so they're favoring ideas for the new normal. So they're really looking for innovation in services. They are looking for a continued focus on communities of color and those who were disproportionately affected by the virus and the economy. And then they're also looking for growth and ensuring that the outcome of all of this work is very equitably distributed to all of the communities. So the other thing you'll notice here is that we have nicknamed each of these 4 quadrants. So you'll see at the upper left is hold my virtual hand, because that's the one that talked about providing more services virtually. The lower left quadrant, I am here for you. The upper right quadrant, protect and defend. And then the lower right quadrant, brave new world. And that's to emphasize that this is the world after COVID, not the world before COVID. So let's take a look at the next slide so we can show you what happens from here. So basically you have 4 plausible ideas of how the world might look, assuming different states of these critical uncertainties. Now you're going to move towards designing a strategy for your organization to meet each of those scenarios. So basically, if we're in Brave New World, this is what your strategy is going to look like. If we're in Hold My Virtual Hand, this is what your strategy is going to look like. So yes, that means you're going to actually create 4 different strategies for your organization. But here's why we like this approach, because it's very different from typical strategic planning, which can often take 6 to 9 months. This is a very fast approach. It is, we don't do extensive data gathering to support the thinking. This is very agile, and it's meant to be kind of rough sketch strategies at this point. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how those get refined as you move into it. But at this point, we're looking to create 4 pretty rough sketch strategies to respond to each of those scenarios. So we created this template to help organizations come up with these rough sketch strategies. So what you'll see is in the upper right corner, there's a gray box that says Brave New World, and that's to flag which of the strategies this template is in particular speaking to. And then in the gray box below that, we have our focal question, how to build diversity, equity, and inclusion into our mission. And so what we're encouraging you to do is work through this template. I don't know if you can see well, but the purple dots actually have numbers in them to indicate the steps of the template. So you follow the numeric order. And you're going to just jot down in pencil, literally in pencil, some of your thoughts about these questions. How will the needs for our services change? What are the implications for our strategic focus? So if our strategic focus is building diversity, equity, and inclusion into all aspects of our organization, then what does that look like when the economy is weak and the infection rates are high? And what does that look like when the economy is strong and the infection rates are low? So you can see that the answers to each of these will be potentially quite different depending on which scenario you're building off of. And then you get to the 4 gray boxes in the middle, which are really your strategy. The white boxes on either side are kind of, it's the warm up to get to the strategy, it's then the strategy, and then the white boxes on the right side are kind of the consequences, the implications of your strategy for your organizational capacity. So in the gray boxes, are there new or unique offerings that you want to develop in this particular scenario to further your strategic focus? Is there anything you feel you need to stop or improve, given this particular scenario? Are there new capacities you're going to need? Are there new or different partners you're going to need? And then once you've figured all that out, what are the resources you have on hand to start to implement this strategy, and what new resources might be needed? So again, this is meant to be fairly quick and dirty, and you can do it in a number of ways. You can have a very small group of people working together to brainstorm this, or you can have a larger group where everybody potentially fills it out ahead of time, and then you come together and have a facilitated meeting to really come up with the kind of top line items or the things that people are most aligned around about the future state of your organization in this particular scenario. So we developed this template to help you kind of work through the mapping process of strategy. And as you can see, it's much more quick and agile than a protracted, research-driven, typical strategic planning process. So now that you've designed your strategy, you're going to monitor the indicators. So what's different here is we're not looking at, usually with strategic planning, implementation plans look like, did we break this down into concrete steps? Did we accomplish all of the concrete steps? So how do we know we actually accomplished what we set out to do? In this instance, you're really monitoring the environment. So how close was your scenario, or were your scenarios, to the way the world is actually starting to unfold? And so we suggest maybe a quarterly review of, okay, where are we now? Because as we can see, the last 3 months have been huge, huge changes in the world. So 3 months is about the right amount of time to stop and reflect and go back and look at what were our assumptions under each of these scenarios and how close are those to the real thing, the way the world is actually unfolding. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. And this could look like a simple chart like this. It doesn't have to be a whole sexy dashboard. It's really just, here were our 4 scenarios. Here were the assumptions that undergirded each of those scenarios. And here's what's actually happening with regard to those assumptions. And so what are the implications, therefore, for each of the strategies we developed to respond to each of those scenarios? So in this one, as you can see, the actuality is showing that the infection rates are still high and the economy is weakened, but then it rebounded around opening up and then it sank again. So it's in a generally weak state. So what this is telling us is the world is leaning toward the hold my virtual hand scenario. So now we know that's among the more likely scenarios that's going to dictate how we have to be able to position our organizations to respond. So that gives you a little more information. And at this point, you go back to your scenario, see if you need to recast it a little bit to more accurately reflect where the world is now. And you go back to your strategy template and you iterate on that again so that you're getting closer to where the world is. So these are not huge swings. These are really just when the world around you is blowing like the wind, as it is right now, how do you manage as a CEO or an executive director or a board member? How do you manage against that when there's so much uncertainty around you? So it's really just these kind of quick and dirty pictures of here's what we think we might do differently, or here's what we think we might maybe pull back on and stop doing or do less of or get better at if we're going to continue to do it. And so it really helps you feel prepared for however the world might unfold. So I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about bias, which is an interesting thing because of the state of the world right now. And I'm actually not talking about racial bias here, although that's in the background of all of our minds today. in particular. I'm actually talking about cognitive biases. So it's important to just be aware of these sort of mental model biases that we all carry. So there's confirmation bias, that we want to see information that confirms what we thought was going to happen. There's ambiguity bias, where we prefer the things that are knowable over the things that are not. And in scenario planning, that's kind of the whole purpose of scenario planning. So it's important to build your muscle of being able to live with a certain degree of ambiguity. And this is kind of the salve for that in a way, because you're feeling like, well, I know the world is ambiguous, but I'm prepared. And then there's status quo bias. So favoring the current situation rather than, and due to not wanting to lose that, rather than, actually taking different action in this circumstance. So those are some of the challenges around scenario planning, and it's just something to be aware of as you're moving through it. Let's talk a little bit about the advantages. One of the biggest advantages is it's quick. We don't overthink it. It is iterative as we gain more knowledge. It is a roadmap. It sort of teaches you how to become more adaptive in your management practice. And it's agile. It really does position you to innovate or to adapt very quickly to what's happening in the world around you. And for us, that's a really important piece, is that organizations don't exist in a vacuum, can't exist in a vacuum, and perhaps now more than ever. I think funders are really seeing that organizations exist to serve their communities. And so it's important to be in constant dialogue with your community and your world around you, so that you're keeping your organization relevant to what's happening in the world around you. So we like scenario planning for this particular kind of situation. So that is the full cycle. And then what you find is, when you've gone through the full cycle the first time, you then kind of hover between 4, 5, and 6, the steps 4, 5, and 6, where you are going back every quarter to perhaps re-articulate your scenarios, perhaps redesign your strategy, and you're continuing to monitor the indicators. And so you kind of live in that world until the world around you starts to become more certain and the pace of change starts to slow down. And at that point, perhaps you can consider moving into a more traditional long-range or strategic planning process. So we are designing these webinars as a free service to the community, just to help you think about what are some of the things, the tools in your toolbox that might be helpful to you as you are managing your organizations in a time of great uncertainty. So we would love to hear from you, just to get a sense of how relevant this content was, how likely you are to use this in the next 6 months. Great, so you're already responding to the poll. So we'll close it out in 3 seconds, 2, 1, and let's take a look at the results. Wow, okay, so good. It's nice to know that we're providing relevant content, and I'm glad that you find this potentially something that would be useful to you. That's great. So a couple brief reminders before we move into Q&A. This webinar is part of a series, as Janice mentioned earlier. We have another one on strategic alliances and mergers coming up on June 9th. And then we have one on organization redesign coming up on June 16th. So you have to register for each of them separately, because we didn't want to assume for you that they were all going to be most relevant to your needs. So pick the ones that you're most interested in registering for, and we encourage you to join us for those. Last but not least, we know that a lot of organizations are having a really hard time financially right now. And so what we have decided to do is make our services available for some discounted consulting in these areas, these 3 areas: scenario planning, mergers and strategic alliances, and organization redesign. So if you find that one of these areas is particularly relevant and feels like a good solution for where you are right now, but you're cash strapped, then please do consider applying to us for discounted consulting services. This is a link to our application form. So again, we'll be sending the slides out to you after today, and you can just follow this link. And of course, contact any of us if you have any questions. We're always here to chat a little more if you just need more information. So let's open it up to Q&A now, and let's take down the slides so we can just talk. And it does look like we have a couple of questions. Have you seen funders who are more likely to fund an organization that has done scenario planning? And does it make sense to do scenario planning as part of a broader strategic planning process? I'm combining those because the same person asked both questions. So I'm going to say I have seen more often funders who are supportive of the idea of doing scenario planning and happy to help fund that. In terms of, does it make sense to do it as part of a broader strategic planning process? I mean, it's substantially quite different. So it might be something that you undertake at the end of a strategic planning process if you're partway through it. Finish out the strategic planning process, and then at the end, if the world is still really volatile, it might be a moment to say, well, how is this going to affect where we came out on our strategy? That could be your focal question. Janice, do you have anything to add there? You're on mute.
Hi. No, I guess the only thing I would add is that having been a funder at one point in my career, I think undergoing this kind of a process, I mean, scenario planning is fairly new. You know, those of us who have been in this field have done traditional strategic planning for decades. And so this is something that's kind of, I think, coming to the forefront now because our world is so unpredictable. And I think they don't require it, certainly. I haven't come across that, but I think it's a good exercise. I know if I were a funder and I noticed that an applicant or a current grantee was actually engaged in this, it would, not raise a red flag, it would raise like a yippee flag. I don't know, but just I would find that impressive, I guess, is what I would say, just because it's a whole other way of thinking, and it just tells me that organization is open to something else that's going to work to help them.
Yeah. There's a follow-up question. Have we seen research that organizations that do scenario planning survive major disruptions in better ways? I'm not sure I have seen formal research, but I've seen anecdotal reports that indicate that. But it's mostly based on kind of case studies and things. So I don't think it's more formalized statistical research. Any other folks have questions? It doesn't look like it. I guess we were crystal clear. That's great. So we will be sending, again, the slides to you, as well as a couple of those handouts. We'll be sending you the sample scenarios that we wrote, as well as a template for you to write your own, and the strategy development template. And you'll have our email addresses in the slides. So again, if you have questions as you begin to look at all of this, and if you're leaning towards this and you have some questions, please feel free to reach out. Yes, I echo Janice's sentiments. Thank you all for joining us. And have a great day.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.